Obesity isn't just about numbers on a scale or your BMI. It's a hidden epidemic silently fueling a range of diseases that we see every day. From heart failure and diabetes to Alzheimer's and even cancer, excess weight is a key player in about 70% of chronic diseases. Today, we expose the shocking truth about how obesity is hijacking our health and just how wide-reaching this problem really is. And welcome back, everybody, to the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast. Thanks so much for stopping by. My name is Jordan Rennicke, and we haven't met yet. I'm a dual board physician in sports and family medicine, and the goal of this podcast is to keep you active and healthy for life through actionable, evidence-informed education. Today, we're covering an article from Hildenbrand and Pfeiffer from the European Journal of Physiology published in February of 2025, and we're talking all about the wide-reaching effects of obesity. So we know obesity is very prevalent. Today, we're going to talk all about that, so let's dive in here. So obesity. Obesity is a major threat to public health and economic development due to its link with non-communicable diseases. They talk about non-communicable diseases here, or NCDs. Those are essentially things that aren't passed on. So we're not talking about like the common cold or things that you can pass or things that are infectious. Non-communicable means, hey, they're caused by some other cause. And obesity is a big one, a really big part of it. And obesity is projected to be the number one preventable risk factor for non-communicable diseases by 2035. And over 70% of non-communicable diseases have a documented association with obesity. So there's a good chance that about 70%, so the vast majority of issues that are not infectious, have some tie to obesity. That's pretty strong. And these NCDs, they're the largest contributors to excess death globally, accounting for about 74% of all global deaths. So let's just stop that for a second. 74% of all global deaths are related to these non-communicable diseases, right? So not infectious diseases. And of that, 70% are related to obesity. So by my math, a whole lot of deaths can be prevented if we can tackle the obesity epidemic. Obviously, much easier said than done. But the main classes of these NCDs regarding mortality are essentially cardiovascular disease, cancer, chronic respiratory diseases, diabetes and kidney diseases, digestive issues, and neurologic diseases. And these non-communicable diseases, they lead to a significant reduction in quality of life, including mental and musculoskeletal disorders. So lots of associations as well. And there's no definitive cure for most NCDs, and long-term treatment is often required. And that's the big thing, right? These chronic diseases. We call them chronic because chronic means they last for a long time. These NCDs, they are not something you just reverse, right? And even if you take a medication for it, it's not reversing it. It's just kind of holding the symptoms at bay. So lots and lots of money to be had. Very, very important topic we're talking about today. So overall, the incidence, there's a high incidence and treatment cost of these NCDs, resulting in a tremendous financial burden on our health system and economic development worldwide, right? It's kind of a crushing amount of money. And almost half, or about 40% of global death can be attributed to risk factors associated with an obesogenic lifestyle or predisposition. And when I mean predisposition, that means we do know that there's a strong genetic component to that. It's not as easy as you have this gene, you will have obesity. We know it's polygenic, meaning multiple genes are affected, but there is a pretty strong tie to that. And almost half of these deaths, global deaths, can be attributed to risk factors leading to these obesogenic lifestyles. So it's not just necessarily obesity, but lifestyle, meaning sedentary behavior, the things we eat, all that stuff. And it's a lot, and it's a huge burden, right? A huge economic burden. We are spending an enormous amount of money on that. And so that is one really important thing that we have to consider, like, what is the cost of obesity? And obesity does steal years away from a healthy life. You know, overweight is defined as a BMI greater than 25. And obesity is above 30 typically, and overweight does still incur a significant risk of death and disease. And overweight and obesity are the fourth most common risk factors for these non-communicable diseases in Europe. And overweight affects about 43% of the global population, and obesity about 16%. Specifically, high income countries, these are more affected with about, the overweight and obesity rates are in America 73.6 and 42.5. So overweight, 73% of people overweight, and obese 42.5%. So that is pretty big. And increasing obesity rates are evident in low and middle income countries as well, which is crazy. They just have not quite as high as us, but the world's catching up. All right, great. So we're seeing the spread everywhere. Obesity is no longer just a Western world problem or a first world country. It is becoming prevalent everywhere unless we do something about it. And a lot of times what can happen is we have a measure that we look at called disability adjusted life years, or DALYS, or DALYs. And this is a way to measure the overall disease burden. And what's happening here, it's measuring this disease burden expressed as a number of years lost due to ill health, disability, or early death. Meaning, hey, based off of where you were born and what time and era and demographics and zip code, all that stuff, you should expect to live here. But if you have some sort of disease that's limiting your health, or you die early, or leading to disability, these DALYs, or DALYS, they are essentially showing what's the difference there. Like, what could have you had and what did you actually have? So it's kind of big. And these NCDs are a major contributor to global disease and burden. And there's about an estimated 1.62 billion disability adjusted life years contributed annually from NCDs. This is just in 2019 alone. And cardiovascular diseases accounted for 400 million DALYs alone. So think of these DALYs or DALYs as a way to measure the total impact of disease on people's lives. So it accounts for both years of life lost because of dying early and years of life lived with disability due to being ill. And overall, the article we're talking about says that non-communicable diseases caused about 1.62 billion DALYs, once again, like I said, in 2019. That was just 2019. So that's a while back there. And that's a huge burden, right? So that's 1.62 billion years of healthy life that were taken from people worldwide. And that's just crazy. It's a huge number. And it just highlights the massive burden of these diseases that they place on society. So once again, just crazy, crazy numbers. We're talking about the 400 million from cardiovascular disease alone. So roughly a quarter of all healthy years lost to these non-communicable diseases can be attributed to heart and blood vessel related issues. That's huge. It's devastating. And it's a really big thing. And so that's these disability. I like thinking about it that way. The reason I like thinking about that is because cool, like Jordan, you give me these stats on obesity is bad, but like this is a tangible thing. Like you could have lived healthy and this long, but because of non-communicable diseases, obesity, lifestyle, things like that, you've lost not only years, but quality years. And that's a really, really big thing because most people are like, okay, what's a year? What's a two? But like quality, everyone seems to click with like, yeah, I want to live a quality life. And so really big deal. That's why I wanted to mention that, and the article did as well. Moving on, chronic overnutrition does fuel a toxic fire. So overweight and obesity, once again, obesity being greater than a 30 BMI, results from an imbalance in energy intake and expenditure. There's some controversy, and I would say controversy loosely, on the internet saying it's not calories, it's hormones. And let's just put that to bed, saying your calories affect your hormones affect your calories. So there is a definitive role in that. So, but either way, I say energy imbalance. So imbalance in energy intake, that is leading to this expenditure. And excess nutrients, when you have excess nutrients, they're stored in adipose tissue, so essentially fat cells. And a chronic net surplus will lead to increased adipose tissue hypertrophy, which is growth of them, beyond the limit of what's a healthy expansion, right? So leading to adipocyte stress, essentially. So they're stressing these adipocytes, so the fat cells, and consequently leads to adipose tissue inflammation and fibrosis. So what we're saying here is when we have more calories than we need, they start to grow the fat cells and they get bigger. And as they get bigger, bad things happen to them. They become inflamed and can become fibrotic or hard, and that's not good. And if not controlled, this local inflammation can actually spill over to other organs and can affect the whole body. In this article, they talk specifically as a process known as metaflammation, meaning, hey, it kind of just spills over and leads to inflammation everywhere. And there's tons of detrimental systemic consequences of that, such as insulin resistance, hyperglycemia, cholesterol abnormalities, and hypertension. And a kind of metabolic syndrome is when you think about multiple of those things. So essentially 3 of those conditions, meaning having insulin resistance, you have abnormalities in your cholesterol, you have waist circumference issues, you have, hypertension, lots of different things. We don't necessarily talk about that, but metabolic syndrome is kind of the aggregate of multiple of those things all put together. And a lot of those are happening because of excess adiposity. And the pathogenesis of the vast majority of non-communicable diseases is negatively affected by excess adiposity in some way, meaning there's some factor going on. The extra fat is not helpful and is being detrimental and causing these NCDs potentially. So moving on, let's talk about specific diseases. So talking about cardiovascular diseases, right? So, living with obesity, I put here a heart attack waiting to happen. That's not necessarily the case, but it does increase your risk. Cardiovascular diseases are the number 1 cause of death globally, and obesity has a strong correlation with cardiovascular disease. Specifically, there's multiple conditions we talk about, things like ischemic heart disease and stroke, so heart attacks. So heart attacks and strokes, big ones. Obesity is a significant independent risk factor for coronary disease. Independent meaning it in of itself seems to have a relationship with it. And there's a direct causal relationship between obesity and both coronary heart disease and ischemic stroke. And chronic overnutrition tends to lead to increased concentrations of VLDL, or very low density lipoproteins, and chylomicrons in the blood, which over time, that leads to higher concentration of atherogenic lipoproteins, which we've talked about these all the time, right? So this leads to lots of LDL essentially, or ApoB particles floating around. And we know that the deposition of these atherogenic lipoproteins, specifically LDL and predominantly, into the subendothelial space of the vascular wall, this is what starts it. And you get inflammation that adds onto it, and it creates this atherosclerotic lesion and initiates the setup for heart disease and creating plaques. So that's kind of the big one. But you also, on top of that, so you not only do you have increased atherogenic particles going around when you have obesity. You also have the reverse, where you have blunted reverse cholesterol transport. So essentially, you're going to lower your HDL. Once again, and HDL is thought to be, quote unquote, good. Cholesterol can be good or bad. It's just carried on these lipoproteins. But HDL essentially works with reverse transport. So it kind of clears out the excess cholesterol and gets it out of the arteries. And that's really important. And you have a lower HDL when you have adiposity, increase obesity. And so that's very not good for you. And on top of that, just having an elevated level of just nutrients. So overnutrition, eating more calories, that can trigger endothelial dysfunction. So we think about heart disease, right? You got to have the lipoproteins, and then you have endothelial dysfunction for them to get in. And then you have inflammation, all that stuff. So just literally eating too much can lead to that endothelial dysfunction, which kind of goes in. And essentially also what can happen is excess adiposity can decrease your insulin sensitivity at specific organs. It can lead to just lots of issues, meaning you have the wrong lipoprotein concentration, you have extra glucose around, lots and lots of issues there. And if you think about it, obesity often leads to a chronic state of systemic inflammation. Like they talked about in the article, this metainflammation, and that enhances the risk of increased lipids, endothelial dysfunction. It just really creates a storm for a heart attack or a stroke, something like that. And on top of that, this inflammation creates increased levels of cytokines, right? And it may worsen the progression and stabilization of atherosclerotic plaque. So long story short, it is not good to have extra inflammation in your body. And so that's why we find that increased adiposity leads to this inflammation. The next disease they talk about specifically is hypertensive heart disease, and obesity is a major cause of hypertension, with an estimated 65 to 78% of hypertension cases attributed directly to obesity and overweight and obesity. Not directly necessarily, but related to that. And obesity initiates hypertension by a couple different ways. We're not entirely sure, right? In the medical world, we call it essential hypertension, meaning, hey, you have hypertension. And the traditional medical establishment, like, well, that's it. Like, here you go on meds. And that's it, without like trying to understand what's the underlying thing. So let's dive a little deeper here. This is a little nerdier, but there's a couple mechanisms that could be happening here. So one is, it could be an impairing kidney function. So they may lead to like mechanisms that include physical stress or compression of the kidneys by the abdominal fat cells. So like actually compression of the kidneys. So that kind of can impact your blood pressure. It may activate the sympathetic nervous system, which is our, you think about fight or flight. This is your fight one, and kind of raises your blood pressure, stuff like that. And on top of that, it may activate the renin and angiotensin aldosterone syndrome, or the RAS syndrome. And this is the one where our most common medications affect. A lot of times we're looking at our ACE inhibitors or ARBs, things like that. We work on the renin angiotensin aldosterone system to decrease our blood pressure. So adiposity may affect all those things. And obesity may also lead to mass hypertension and increased pulse pressure due to increased cardiac output during everyday activity. So if you have extra tissue, you got to work a little bit harder, and so that can sometimes happen and lead to a risk factor for hypertension as well. So we're not sure necessarily why, but we think adiposity, insulin resistance plays a role. The next one we talk about is aortic stenosis. And aortic stenosis is essentially a hardening of one of the valves of your heart. And obesity has been demonstrated to be a risk factor for aortic stenosis development. And they found this study, and they mentioned at least, that an increase in BMI of only 1 kilogram per meter squared, so one number, increases the risk of aortic stenosis by over 50%. So that's quite a bit. And another one, and we talk about the last one here, is aortic aneurysm. Aortic aneurysm is kind of an outpouching of a blood vessel, and obesity has once again been associated with that. And it's a frequent in, when we see aortic aneurysms, a complication and risk factor of that. So lots and lots of cardiovascular diseases that are tied to obesity. So once again, this is the biggest cause of disease is cardiovascular disease, but obviously cardiovascular disease, stroke, aortic aneurysms, all those things are bad. We don't want to get them. And they have a direct relationship to obesity and increased adiposity. So that's just interesting. So let's talk about lungs here. This is one that was very kind of intriguing to me, because I didn't think it would necessarily make a difference, in your lungs. Like, what's going on? Well, inflammation can affect your lungs too, not shockingly. And obesity seems to have a tie with predominantly asthma. When they talked about these lung pathologies, it was predominantly asthma. And it seems like obesity does have a risk of that. And weight loss interventions seem to improve lung function in asthmatic patients, specifically in children, they're mentioning. And maternal obesity can increase the risk of developing asthma. And so we typically, once again, have extra adipose tissue that causes inflammation. And this inflammation is seen in a higher level than those who have obesity. And that can lead to inflammation in lungs, causing things like asthma, which is, I thought, super interesting. And metabolic dysfunction actually was found to be a stronger predictor of asthma than development, than fat mass and obesity. So specifically, metabolic dysfunction, what that means is, more like or insulin resistant or on that spectrum, that seemed to be a better indicator than necessarily fat mass or, in obesity. So more metabolic dysfunction, but once again, they go hand in hand, right? We're talking about metabolic syndrome, all those things. So they definitely go hand in hand. But once again, I thought this was kind of interesting that your lungs can be affected by obesity too. Moving on to diabetes, we are definitely struggling to diabetes this. That is a reference to The Office, but type 2 diabetes is the most common comorbidity of obesity. And severe obesity incurs a lifetime risk of developing type 2 diabetes by about 70 to 75%. So in this study, they mentioned like severe obesity. They didn't really mention what that was, but they're saying pretty much a lifetime risk of developing diabetes if you have severe obesity is like 70 to 75%. So you're pretty much saying, hey, yep, if you are at a severe level, which I imagine for them is probably like 35 or 40 BMI, probably something around there they didn't mention, but really increases your risk of having type 2 diabetes. And more than about 80% of patients with type 2 diabetes are obese. So obviously every once in a while we get people who are not obese, right? Have a normal BMI and you're like, oh, this is definitely abnormal. But the vast majority of patients who have type 2 diabetes are indeed obese. And more than 6% of the world's population have type 2 diabetes, and over 1 million deaths per year can be attributed to the disease. This is one you don't want to get, folks. For anybody who's ever taken care of patients with diabetes, specifically it's not well controlled, it really leads to a lot of issues. It leads to issues with your eyes, with your lungs, with your kidneys, with your heart, with like literally anything that has blood vessels there, like we can have issues with it. So predominantly what we see are increased risk of heart attacks. We see wounds, diabetic foot ulcers that leads to amputations and all that stuff. So there's just a lot of stuff. And we now know there's a causal link between obesity and type 2 diabetes. And that's well understood and we want to protect that. And the mechanism behind that, a little less clear, but evidence suggests that a combination of at least 3 factors are playing. One is increased insulin resistance due to, once again, chronic adipose tissue inflammation and dysregulation of different cytokines. 2 might be increased hepatic gluconeogenesis, so we're just making more glucose because we think we need it, and then decreased function of the pancreatic beta cells where the insulin comes from. We think those are kind of like the causal things, and it's led and triggered by a lot of times inflammation. And so that's just something I thought that was interesting. And another comment, we talk about type 1 versus type 2. Type 1 also seems to have some association. Both parental and maternal obesity do seem to increase the risk of developing type 1 diabetes in their offspring. So in your kids, a higher risk. So patients who have obesity have a high risk of having children who have type 1 diabetes. And like I said, we're learning more and more and more about autoimmune diseases and stuff like that. But overall, the theme that we're constantly seeing here over and over and over is that increased adipocytes leads to increased inflammation and leads to bad stuff is pretty much the simpleton way of thinking about that. So moving on here, next we're talking about a gut-wrenching reality of essentially hepatosteatosis and cirrhosis. So there's something called metabolic dysfunction associated steatotic liver disease, or MASLD, formerly known as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's so much easier, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but they've separated it now and that's okay. But it's characterized by excessive fat accumulation in the liver. And overnutrition is the primary cause of this MASLD, and obesity or overweight is one of the 5 cardiometabolic criteria for MASLD diagnosis, right? You don't just get that if you are metabolically healthy, it happens being, metabolically unhealthy. And the prevalence of this, MASLD in overweight and obese patients is around 70 to 75%. And I can attest to this, man. It seems like every time I have a patient who has obesity and I'm worried about, and they're just, their A1C is not good and their blood sugars are bad. I'll check a lot of times labs looking at their liver numbers, and quite frequently their liver numbers are elevated. And it's almost always because of this. Super common thing. And then if they lose a bunch of weight, it seems to get better and improve most of the time, which is crazy. And the reason we care so much about this is because this can then progress to something called cirrhosis. And cirrhosis is really bad. It's kind of essentially scarring of the liver tissue. And it is reported in about 9 to 12% of morbidly obese patients. And so, that's it. But as I mentioned before, weight loss leads to reduction in hepatic steatosis and MASLD patients in a dose-dependent manner, meaning the more you lose, the better you're going to get on that. So that's a big one. That's probably the most common one that we see, all over, like primary care. Like every single day, you'll pretty much see that in patients who are not well controlled. Another one to mention, though, is inflammatory bowel disease. So things specifically like Crohn's. There does seem to be some association with obesity and Crohn's. It seems like obesity increases the risk of Crohn's disease in a more rapid clinical course. That is one that is still being explored, but I thought it was interesting. And another one is pancreatitis, which we see quite frequently as well. Obesity does increase the risk of acute pancreatitis. Hypertriglyceridemia, which is common in obese patients, also can be tied to pancreatitis. So once again, hand in hand, obesity, inflammation, dysfunction in your lipid panel, high triglycerides, that is a big risk of pancreatitis as well. And that's one that we've seen pretty commonly, and definitely not a fun one. Anyone who's ever taken care of anybody hospitalized for pancreatitis knows it does not look like a fun time. So that is another one there. Moving on here, it's all in your head and fat cells, talking about cognitive impairment and the relationship there. And there have been links between overweight and obesity with cognitive impairment. Specifically, adiposity and its comorbidities, it does influence both the development and potential progression of the most common neurodegenerative diseases. So specifically Alzheimer's we're talking about here, Parkinson's our big one. Alzheimer's, there's an association between midlife obesity and Alzheimer's diagnosis later in life. And metabolic syndrome as a consequence of obesity might be a stronger risk factor. So once again, a lot of times we're saying, oh, like it's obesity. It's very hard to isolate that out, right? It's not gonna be like, hey, we're gonna give you obesity and you not obesity and see what happens in life. Like we can't do those trials. So we're saying we, run statistical analyses, the fancy ones and the covariates, trying to pull out confounders, and they say, oh, we think it's the obesity. How do you tie that away from the metabolic dysfunction? Oh, it's really hard because a lot of times if you have increased adiposity, obesity, you're going to have metabolic dysfunction as well. So they're saying here, though, it might be more your metabolic dysfunction that is linked to the stronger risk for Alzheimer's disease, but not entirely sure. And for Parkinson's, they did find that abdominal obesity or waist circumference and body shape index have been found to be significantly increase your risk for Parkinson's disease. And once again, type 2 diabetes is a risk factor for Parkinson's. Another one they mentioned in the study is multiple sclerosis, and obesity in either childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood has been shown to significantly increase the risk of MS later in life, which is interesting. And seems to be a causal relationship between both BMI and visceral adiposity once again. And they actually did that through Mendelian randomization. So Mendelian randomization means you look at a trait. One group has one trait, one group does not have the other, and see what happens in them, saying, hey, the ones that are triggered that have a higher BMI and visceral adiposity tend to have a higher risk of MS. This one's not quite as strong and well-known. Alzheimer's is a little more well-known, but there's a lot of people talking about this now, right? They're kind of saying, have you heard some people say that Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes, which, I don't know what to make of that, but they're saying that it's so strongly associated with metabolic disease. So there's definitely something to that, which I thought was really interesting. All right, so now let's move on to the link between obesity and cancer. And there's a well-established link between many types of cancer and obesity. Globally, about 4 to 8% of all new cancer diagnoses in adults and between 5 to 20% of all cancer deaths have been attributed to obesity. So that's pretty significant. And some cancers show particularly strong associations with BMI, specifically gastrointestinal, uterine, kidney, pancreatic, and breast cancers. And as I mentioned before, esophageal cancer, obesity is a major risk factor. Colorectal cancer, it seems like weight gain in adulthood and early life increase your risk for colorectal cancer. And they've even shown that, really interesting, bariatric surgery for weight loss has been shown to reduce the risk of colon cancer by approximately 27%. So just the act of losing the weight seems to decrease the risk for cancer. Gynecologic cancers, carcinoma of the endometrium is the most common and shows strongest correlation with obesity. Breast cancer, there are definitely ties to that. In postmenopausal women, obesity is positively correlated with a increased risk of cancer. Pancreatic as well. Several meta-analyses have found a significant increased risk of pancreatic cancer in obese individuals, which is interesting. And weight loss induced by bariatric surgery, once again, has been shown to significantly reduce the risk of pancreatic cancer, which I thought just absolutely fascinating. Once again, showing that the weight loss does do something. It's not just weight. We know that that's important. And it used to just be like, it's good to lose weight because it's good to lose weight. But we've learned now how inflammatory adipocytes can be, and just extra adipose tissue can be inflammatory. And that's not ideal. And there's one thing I did want to mention real quick, and you may see this online. This is why I want to mention. It's called the Obesity Paradox. So they'll say, obesity is actually good, or being overweight is good sometimes. Sometimes in the data, increased BMI seems to be beneficial. And the Obesity Paradox actually has been recognized in cardiovascular disease patients for over 2 decades, yet remains kind of controversial. But there have been more recent data looking at this, and these analyses that looked at waist to hip ratios instead of BMI have not found a protective effect of adiposity. So what they did essentially, BMI is crude, right? It's just height over, it includes your height and your weight. Essentially is all it is. It doesn't do anything about body composition or fat distribution. They're saying when you look at a waist to hip ratio, that is measuring how your fat is distributed through your body. That has a much closer tie to that and does not seem to have a protective effect. So essentially they found people who have really big hips and their fat distribution is around their belly, visceral fat, all that stuff, that those people do not seem to be protected. Obesity and BMI for those people may seem protective, but then you actually delve out where that fat's being stored, does not seem to be doing that. And they thought maybe they found this protection because it was due to reduced cardiovascular fitness, sarcopenia, and increased frailty in the non-obese groups, meaning the non-obese groups were not healthy to begin with. So comparing them didn't seem to matter. But once again, when we're looking for kind of body fat distribution, it seems to matter. And the obesity paradox has also been observed in cancer patients. And once again, it seems like body composition may matter. Obese patients with sarcopenia have the worst outcomes. So there may not be a paradox when using better markers for adiposity. Once again, sarcopenia means also decreased muscle mass. So when you have increased adiposity, so increased fat and decreased muscle, that is a really bad recipe. And so those people have the worst outcomes. They're saying probably has more to do with body composition once again than necessarily just that. However, there was one interesting one they mentioned, ALS, so amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It's one of the few examples of these NCDs in which obesity seems to be protective. The thought here is maybe there's a larger energy reservoir at the disease onset, which could prolong the health span of ALS patients. I thought that was kind of interesting. You're going to find every once in a while, right? You'll find something like smoking actually can be protective of certain types of like colon disease. So it's like one of those things. It's not an example of like, oh, this is why it's okay. No, it's not ideal. We're definitely not going for that. So overall though, obesity is bad, but the people who have it are not. That's the biggest thing I want to say. There's definitely a clear link between non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases and obesity. And obesity is that leading cause for developing these chronic diseases. Obesity is also linked to those NCDs that have grave consequences, right? So these are big things we're talking about here. Developing diabetes, hypertension, heart attacks, strokes, I mean, you name it, it's associated with obesity. They have grave consequences. But I think we have to be careful, right? There's definitely an urgent need for enormous lifestyle change, right? So we need to change the food environment, maybe medications, lots of things. There's lots of things we have to do, but I want to make sure we separate having obesity and those people who have obesity, right? So there's a clear link, and it is not healthy. I mean, anybody who goes out there and says like, you can have adiposity and it's totally fine, I'm not worried about you, you got no risk for anything. They are I'll say they are misconstruing the data a little bit is how I'll say. I'll try to be charitable with that take. Can you be metabolically healthy and have extra adiposity? Absolutely, you can. But what we're showing here and what I'm trying to purvey here is that when you have increased adiposity, increased fat cells, lots of them, you are by definition going to have probably more inflammation in your body. And that is a ticking time bomb for bad things to happen. You don't want us to have uncontrolled, unchecked inflammation in your body. And that's what happens when we have excess adiposity. So once again, that's not to say, hey, you can run around with, nothing, no body fat, and you're going to be perfectly healthy. That's not the case. Life's much more complicated than that. But like saying what's dangerous is when you say, hey, it doesn't matter at all if you're obese, like you can be healthy at any size, no matter what. And I think, yes, I want to say that we want to strive to be metabolically healthy and continue to exercise. And it doesn't matter what your size, do the right things, exercise. That's great. You get amazing benefits from that. But to say that there's no association or anything like that, like I just think that's disingenuous and that's not helpful. And it is a risk. So, but once again, separating that issue that people have versus those people, the people still deserve love and respect and good medical treatment. And that's something that's really important. I want to say that, a lot of times we'll just blame things there and forget, like, oh, you have obesity, like that's it. There can be other issues as well. It's not necessarily a cause of everything. I might say it has a lot of causes and a lot of issues it may be related to. Absolutely. But it's not everything. So that's just a big takeaway is that separate that, this is a disease someone has. This is something I always talk about. People who have high blood pressure, there's no real stigma there. You can't see it, someone walking around and you can't see someone has high blood pressure. And also in the medical community, it's like, oh, they have blood pressure. Yep, let's treat it and let's keep moving on. Let's work on other things. Like obesity is like the one disease where it's like, you can see it, right? You can see it on someone and we get fixated on it saying like, okay, this is causing everything. Yes. Should we work on it? Yes. It's a risk factor and I will talk about it and we should work on it. And that is, absolutely imperative. But there's a person underneath that who is struggling with that, who understands that as well. And so, yeah, just be kind and courteous, and it's a lot more challenging for some people than others. And so that's just my one caveat there. And so, but overall, that's going to do it for the podcast today. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. If you like this, it would mean the world to me if you like the video on YouTube, subscribe to the podcast or YouTube channel, or share this with a friend. I mean, if you share it, that's the highest compliment you can give me. Now get off your phone, get outside, and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time.